Imagine this, it's a random Tuesday, roughly 40,000 years ago. You're chilling in your cave somewhere in what's now freezing cold Germany. There's no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no Uber Eats, and definitely no stainless steel Samsung refrigerator sitting in the corner. I mean, obviously, right? But here's the actual dilemma. You and your hunting crew just spent the last 3 days tracking, chasing, and somehow bringing down a literal woolly mammoth. We are talking about 4 tons of pure high-calorie protein and fat. It's the ultimate jackpot. Your entire clan is cheering, doing the Pleistocene equivalent of a touchdown dance. But then, reality hits. You can't just eat 4 tons of meat in one sitting. I don't care how big your appetite is. If you leave it sitting out, it's going to spoil, rot, and attract every single apex predator within a 50-mile radius. We're talking cave hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and massive cave bears that would love nothing more than to steal your hard-earned groceries and make you their dessert. So, what do? How do you keep hundreds of pounds of prime mammoth steaks fresh for the next few weeks, or even months, when the concept of an electrical grid won't be invented for another 39,000 years? Today, we are diving deep into the frosty, brilliant world of Ice Age food tech. We're going to look at the actual science, the mind-blowing archaeological discoveries, and the sheer unfiltered cleverness of how Neanderthals kept their food frozen without a fridge. Let's get into it. The ultimate cold room. Alright, so let's start with the most obvious asset they had, their environment. During the peak of the last glacial period, Europe was basically a giant open-air walk-in freezer. But you can't just leave meat sitting out on top of the snow. Why? Because of the elements, birds, and scavengers. If the sun comes out even for a few hours, the surface temperature can rise just enough to kickstart bacterial growth. So, Neanderthals looked down. They looked at the ground beneath their feet. Enter the ultimate cheat code of the Ice Age, permafrost. For anyone who doesn't know, permafrost is just a fancy word for soil, rock, or sediment that remains completely frozen at or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 consecutive years. In Ice Age Europe, the permafrost layer wasn't just some rare geological feature. It was everywhere. It was literally the floor of their world. Now, digging into permafrost? Oh man, it is not easy. It's essentially like trying to dig a hole into solid concrete. If you've ever tried to dig up half-frozen dirt in your backyard during winter, multiply that by 100. But Neanderthals were incredibly strong. Physically, their bone structure and muscle mass were significantly denser than ours. And they had tools. They used hardened wooden digging sticks, heavy stone axes, and even the massive antlers of red deer or megafauna bones to chop away at the frozen earth. They were digging cellars, literal freezer cellars. Archaeologists have found evidence of these intentional pits dug deep into the frozen ground near Neanderthals' long-term base camps. By digging down past the topsoil that might thaw during the brief summer months, they could access the perpetual freeze underneath. Think about how brilliant this is. They would line these pits with rocks to insulate them, drop their wrapped meat inside, and cover the top with massive heavy stones or logs to seal it shut. It's literally a prehistoric cooler box. Inside these permafrost pits, the temperature stayed perfectly stable. No fluctuations, no rot. It stopped the bacteria dead in its tracks. This allowed them to store a massive surplus of food, meaning they didn't have to risk their lives on a highly dangerous hunt every single day. They could hunt big, store big, and actually vibe in their caves for a bit while the blizzard raged outside. Ice baby, the frozen lakes and bogs technique. But okay, what happens when you aren't living directly on top of deep permafrost? Or what if it's the transition season and the ground is a soggy mess? Neanderthals had a plan B, and honestly, plan B might be even cooler than plan A. They used bodies of water as natural refrigerators. Let's think about the physics of a frozen lake or a deep, cold peat bog. During the winter, the top layer of a lake freezes solid, creating a thick, protective barrier of ice. But underneath that ice, the water stays at an incredibly consistent, near-freezing temperature, usually right around 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Neanderthals realized that if they could submerge their meat under the ice, the water would do 2 incredible things simultaneously. First, it kept the meat profoundly cold, preserving it perfectly. Second, and this is the real galaxy brain move, the cold water in the thick ice shield completely cut off the supply of oxygen. Why does oxygen matter? Because most of the nasty bacteria that cause meat to rot and spoil need oxygen to survive and multiply. By sinking their food to the bottom of a freezing, low-oxygen lake or a highly acidic peat bog, they were basically vacuum sealing their groceries. Now, you might be wondering, wait, how did they stop the meat from just floating away or getting lost under the ice? Well, they weren't just tossing a steak into a pond and hoping for the best. Archaeologists studying ancient hunting sites have found evidence suggesting that early humans would weigh down meat using heavy stones. They would wrap the meat securely, often using animal hides or woven weighted nets, and attach heavy rocks to anchor the whole package to the muddy bottom of the lake or stream. When they needed food, they would just walk out onto the ice, chop a hole through the surface using their heavy stone hand axes, and haul the meat up using sturdy leather thongs or sinew ropes. The power of cave, but let's talk about the ultimate symbol of the Ice Age lifestyle, caves. We call them cavemen for a reason, right? Even though they spent plenty of time out on the open plains in temporary shelters, caves were their fortresses. They were safe, they were sturdy, and crucially, they possessed a very specific kind of microclimate that Neanderthals exploited to the absolute max. Caves are nature's original climate-controlled buildings. If you've ever gone on a tour of a deep cave system during a scorching hot summer day, you already know what I'm talking about. The moment you step past the cave mouth, the temperature drops instantly. Deep underground, away from the surface weather, a cave's temperature stabilizes completely. It usually locks in at the average annual temperature of that specific geographic region. During the Ice Age, the deep interior of a limestone cave wasn't just cool, it was a permanent icebox. Neanderthals were master spatial planners. When you look at the layout of a Neanderthal cave site, it's not just a chaotic mess. It's highly organized. They had a specific zone near the entrance where they kept their fires burning and did their daily living, because that's where the light and fresh air were. But the back of the cave, the deep, dark, pitch-black tunnels where the air was stagnant and freezing cold, that was their pantry. In these deep cave chambers, the air temperature stayed consistently just above or right at freezing, year-round. Neanderthals would construct dedicated rock structures, almost like small stone pantries, deep inside these zones. They would stack rocks to create elevated shelves, keeping their meat off the damp cave floor and away from insects. The air circulation in these deep chambers was incredibly slow, which created a perfect low-humidity, cold environment. It was ideal for dry-aging meat. Freeze-drying and the tundra wind. Alright, now we are getting to my absolute favorite technique, because it involves a piece of science that feels completely ahead of its time. We're talking about natural freeze-drying. When most people think of the Ice Age, they think of massive piles of heavy, wet snow, but geologists actually describe the Ice Age tundra, specifically the Mammoth Steppe, as a cold desert. The air was incredibly dry, and the winds sweeping across the northern plains were absolutely brutal, relentless, and freezing. Neanderthals figured out how to weaponize this brutal wind to preserve their food through a process called sublimation. Science class check. Sublimation is what happens when a solid turns directly into a gas, completely skipping the liquid phase. It's exactly how modern, high-tech freeze-drying works. When you buy freeze-dried strawberries or space food, they freeze the food and then lower the pressure so the frozen water evaporates directly out of it. Neanderthals did this manually, using the weather. They would slice meat into very thin, uniform strips. Then they would hang these strips on elevated wooden racks or high tree branches out on the open, windswept tundra during days when the temperature was well below freezing, but the sun was out. The fierce, freezing wind would instantly freeze the moisture inside the thin strips of meat. Then, over the course of days, the ultra-dry air and the sunlight would cause that frozen moisture to sublimate, evaporating directly into the atmosphere without ever melting back into liquid water. The result? The meat became completely dehydrated while remaining totally frozen during the process. This left them with a lightweight, intensely nutrient-dense, and completely shelf-stable food source. It was basically the OG beef jerky, but created via a natural freeze-drying loop. Because the water was entirely removed, the meat couldn't rot, even if the temperature warmed up later during a move or a long journey. They could pack these lightweight dried meat strips into leather pouches and carry months' worth of high-energy fuel on their backs without any risk of it spoiling. It was the ultimate survival food for a nomadic lifestyle. Beyond the freezing wasn't their only move. To beat the eventual spring thaw, Neanderthals paired the cold with other genius hacks. First, smoking. They'd hang meat over smoky fires to coat it in natural antimicrobial compounds like phenols. This created a tough, protective shield against bugs and mold. Next, natural preservatives. They rubbed raw salt and wood ash onto the meat. This used osmosis to draw out moisture and kill bacteria before it even hit the ice. Haha. Finally, they made the original protein bar, Ice Age pemmican. They pounded dried meat into powder, mixed it with hot fat and wild berries, and packed it into animal bladders. Once frozen, this high-calorie, vitamin C-packed superfood was completely indestructible, keeping them alive when hunting was impossible. Hit that subscribe button right now, or I'm telling a woolly mammoth where you live. Haha.